May 10, 1940. Delft, the Netherlands. A pale spring sun hung low over the canals, casting soft light across the brick houses lining the quiet streets. Birds sang above the rooftops. The sweet, warm smell of morning bread drifted from a nearby bakery. On any other day, the city of Delft would have woken gently, bicycles rattling over cobblestones, students rushing toward the technical university, families preparing for another peaceful morning. But not today. 7-year-old Ronald Waterman jolted awake to a thunderous pounding that shook the windows in their frames. He pushed himself upright in bed, heart racing. Someone was banging on the roof, or the walls, or everywhere at once. He scrambled to the edge of the mattress and shouted down the hallway, "Mama, tell them to stop banging!" But the banging didn't stop. It grew sharper, louder. The air itself felt like it was trembling. Ronald jumped from the bed and sprinted barefoot across the wooden floorboards. When he reached the living room, he froze. His mother, Marie, stood at the window in her nightgown, one hand pressed to her mouth. His father, Professor Hein Israel Waterman, tall, bespectacled, scholarly, had shoved the window open and leaned out into the dawn light. Behind him, Ronald saw it too. Smoke. Black columns rising toward the sky from the direction of The Hague. Sharp flashes along the horizon. White bursts that didn't match the soft morning sun. The thundering continued, now recognizable as booming explosions. His father pulled back from the window, his face pale. "Ron," he said quietly, "that's not banging." He knelt, placing his hands firmly on the boy's shoulders. "It's the beginning of the war." Outside, anti-aircraft guns hammered the sky. The first German planes roared overhead, their engines screaming like predators streaking toward prey. The ground seemed to vibrate beneath their home. Ronald felt the world tilt sideways. He didn't understand war, not truly, but he felt fear rise in his chest, heavy and cold. Behind them, the radio crackled to life. The announcer's voice trembled. "Enemy aircraft over Dutch territory. Citizens are advised to—" Static swallowed the rest. Marie closed the curtains with shaking hands. "What do we do? Hein, what do we do?" "We stay calm," he said. "We stay together. And we hope the army holds the line." But even he didn't sound convinced. The next days passed in a blur of sirens, blackouts, hurried whispers, and the distant roar of engines. The Netherlands fought hard, but the German advance was relentless. Rotterdam burned. The Queen fled. On May 15th, the Dutch army surrendered. Life under occupation began immediately. At first, changes came slowly. German soldiers patrolling streets, posters written in sharp Gothic letters plastered across brick walls, checkpoints on the bridges. Most of Delft carried on as best it could. Bicycles still clattered, shops still opened, children still played, though with quieter voices and watchful eyes. But Ronald noticed everything. The way his father, proudly Jewish though not religious, straightened his shoulders when SS officers passed. The way neighbors lowered their voices when discussing news. The way fear crept into conversations like a silent intruder. And then the occupation arrived at the Waterman home itself. One morning, a Wehrmacht soldier, young, blonde, with a polite stiffness about him, knocked on their door. He carried official papers stating that German personnel were to be housed in designated civilian residences. Hein Waterman invited him in with forced courtesy. The soldier behaved with surprising civility. He removed his boots before entering the sitting room, thanked Marie for her tea, and nodded respectfully to the children. Ronald watched him closely, nervous but confused. This man was nothing like the monsters he'd imagined. Weeks later, the Wehrmacht soldier was reassigned. His replacement arrived in a black uniform, an SS officer. Elegant, cold, arrogant. He did not remove his boots. He did not thank Marie for her tea. He moved through their home as though he owned it. Ronald felt danger in the man's presence the way a small animal senses a predator. By 1942, life grew tighter. Ronald could no longer go to school. A yellow star appeared on his clothing, big, bright, impossible to hide. Children he once played with now stared at him from across the street, unsure whether to wave. Restrictions multiplied. Radios were confiscated, bicycles seized. Jews banned from public spaces, curfews imposed. Still, the Waterman family hoped. His father, well-connected in academic circles, placed their names on the Barneveld list, a registry that supposedly protected Jews deemed culturally or scientifically valuable. The family was also placed on the Palestine list, intended for prisoner exchanges. False hope, but hope nonetheless. One afternoon, Ronald heard loud footsteps on the porch. Dutch police, NSB collaborators wearing dark uniforms, entered without knocking. They ransacked drawers, took silverware, demanded papers. Ronald felt the shame burn into him like a brand. Days later, German police came to arrest them. They were marched to a station under armed guard. Ronald clung to his mother's hand, shaking. His father, desperate, insisted they were on the Barneveld list. Papers were checked, phone calls made. Hours later, miraculously, they were released. But their time in Delft was ending. In March 1943, the Waterman family, father, mother, 4 children, were ordered to report to Barneveld. Ronald didn't understand why adults whispered, why his mother cried quietly into her scarf, or why his father walked with a rigid, haunted expression. He only knew they were leaving the home where he'd been born, where laughter once filled the halls, where peace once lived. And the road ahead was dark. March 29, 1943. Schaffelaar Castle, Barneveld, the Netherlands. A gray mist clung low over the meadows as the Waterman family stepped from the transport truck onto the muddy grounds outside Schaffelaar Castle. The brick towers rose above them, once a symbol of privilege, now a place of confinement. Ronald, 7 years old and clutching a small cloth bag, stared up at the castle's tall windows, half expecting to see ghosts peering down. Hein Israel Waterman stood stiffly beside his wife, Marie, slipping an arm around her shoulders as SS guards barked orders. The air smelled of wet stone and smoke. The Barneveld list had indeed sent them to a special place, one filled with professors, musicians, scientists, doctors. Men and women who had once contributed to Dutch culture, now reduced to prisoners dressed in patched coats and yellow stars. Inside, the long hallway echoed with the hollow sound of footsteps. Families crowded into makeshift rooms. Suitcases lined the walls. Children whispered in small, tight clusters. Ronald walked beside his older siblings, Jacques, Abraham, and little Annette, holding tight to his mother's hand. He didn't understand everything, but he understood enough. They were here because they were Jewish, and Jews had no safety left in their own country. Their assigned room was small, bare walls, hard mattresses, one narrow window overlooking the damp courtyard. Hein set down their last remaining suitcase, and Marie drew the children close, as if shielding them from the reality pressing in from every direction. Outside the window, other families arrived, faces pale with fear, eyes darting toward the SS guards who watched from the castle steps like silent hawks. Yet inside the Barneveld community, something strange happened. Life tried, again and again, to push its way back in. Days turned into weeks. Spring pushed against the cold, and within the castle walls, a quiet intellectual society formed itself out of necessity. Scientists discussed biology at lunch tables. Music professors taught scales to children on battered pianos. Historians debated with soft, urgent voices long after lights out. Ronald wandered through it all with wide eyes. He wasn't allowed to attend a real school anymore, but here, surrounded by exiled scholars, learning took on a life of its own. One evening, a biologist crouched beside Ronald with a net and a jar. "Help me," the man whispered, smiling gently. "We're cataloging insects for the museum in Leiden. Those beetles there, see them? Those are important." Ronald followed him across the courtyard grass, chasing butterflies and beetles, marveling at the vibrant colors of tiny wings and iridescent shells. He didn't know it then, but the specimens he collected would one day sit in Leiden's National Natural History Museum. Real artifacts from a time when a child's brief joy survived inside a world on fire. Those afternoons hunting insects felt almost normal, almost safe. But safety in Barneveld was an illusion, with cracks widening by the day. The castle's atmosphere shifted in late September. Guards grew harsher. Rumors swirled, whispers about Westerbork, about transports, about reassignments. On the morning of September 29, 1943, an eerie silence settled over the courtyard. Clouds hovered low. The air felt heavy, electric. Wrong. Then the boots came. SS units surrounded the castle in a sudden, coordinated movement. Trucks rolled up through the gate. Soldiers shouted orders in sharp German. Panic rippled through the halls as families scrambled for their belongings. Marie grabbed Ronald's coat, her hands trembling. Stay close to me," she whispered, voice breaking. Hein tried to reason with the SS officers. "We are on the Barneveld list. We are under special protection." But the soldiers ignored him. The Frederick's plan meant nothing now. Every Jewish family in Barneveld was pushed out, herded like livestock toward the waiting trucks. Ronald clung to his mother's side as the family stepped onto the truck bed, surrounded by frightened faces he recognized. Children he'd played with, scholars he'd followed through the courtyard. The truck lurched forward. Schaffelar Castle shrank behind them. Barneveld was no longer a shelter. It had become a trap. Westerbork Transit Camp, October 1943. The first thing Ronald noticed was the barbed wire, endless rows of it, stretching across flat countryside as far as his young eyes could see. Watchtowers loomed overhead, silhouettes against a bleak sky. Inside the camp, the ground was churned to mud. Barracks rose in long wooden rows, each one echoing with the noise of desperate humanity. Crying children, whispered prayers, soft arguments in Dutch, Yiddish, German. Every week, trains departed for the East, trains that never returned. Ronald didn't know the names, Auschwitz, Sobibor, Bergen-Belsen, but he heard the way adults spoke them in hushed, terrified breaths. At night, he lay awake listening to the shouting, the trains, the crying. His brothers huddled close. His mother stroked his hair until he slept. His father stared into the dark as if trying to piece together an impossible puzzle. How a nation of scholars, doctors, musicians, and ordinary families had been turned into ghosts waiting for deportation. One morning, Ronald woke in the camp hospital, feverish, weak, his body trembling. He remembered only fragments, cold hands lifting him, bright lights, whispered worry in Dutch and German. For days he drifted in and out of consciousness. He survived. He didn't know that hundreds of other children didn't. From his hospital cot, he watched weekly transports leave, lines of people boarding cattle cars, some crying, some silent, all disappearing into the horizon. He didn't know where those trains went. Adults knew, and adults wept. Nearly a year passed. Hope faded. The Barneveld list meant nothing. The Palestine list meant nothing. Protection was a fiction. Then came September 4th, 1944. The day the waterman's turn arrived. SS guards lined the platform. Families pushed into crowded cattle cars. No seats, no room, no air. Ronald was 10 now, old enough to feel fear in full. "We spent 2 days and 2 nights locked in a cattle car," he would recall. "There were 75 of us. and one bucket. The smell, the heat, the desperation. On September 6, 1944, the doors slid open. Terezínstadt, a name spoken only in fear. The shouting began, the beatings, the chaos, and Ronald clung to his mother, still searching for a toilet in the nightmare that greeted him. September 6, 1944. Terezín, Terezínstadt, Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. The cattle car door slammed open with a metallic crack that echoed across the rail yard. Blinding daylight flooded inside, followed by the barking of German orders. Ronald squeezed his mother's hand so tightly his knuckles turned white. After 2 days and 2 nights trapped in the suffocating dark, the world outside felt unreal, sharp, loud, and hostile. SS guards prowled the platform like wolves, striking at prisoners with truncheons to hurry them forward. The 10-year-old boy stumbled from the car onto the gravel, legs shaking beneath him. His parents guided him through the chaos as families were sorted into lines, luggage scattered everywhere, crying blending with shouted commands. And through it all, one memory burned. "I desperately needed to pee," Ronald would later say, "but I couldn't find a toilet." Men and women pushed past him, some falling, some screaming, some barely able to walk. The air reeked of sweat, fear, and coal smoke. Long rows of barracks stretched ahead, their windows dark and unwelcoming. Terezín did not look like a city. It looked like a trap disguised as one. The guards forced the Waterman family toward the Hamburg barracks, the designated section for Dutch Jews. Inside, the stench hit them instantly. Overcrowded bunks, moldy straw mattresses, damp air thick with illness. Ronald climbed onto a narrow wooden bunk where 3 other boys already sat huddled together. He had never felt smaller. In the days that followed, Terezín revealed its true nature. Unlike Auschwitz or Treblinka, which were built solely for murder, Terezínstadt was engineered for deception. It was the model ghetto the Nazis showed to foreign delegations, a stage set meant to convince the world Jews were being treated humanely. But the facade fooled only those desperate to be fooled. Behind the painted storefronts, cultural performances, and tidy squares crafted for propaganda film crews, starvation and disease ruled. The population was swollen far beyond the garrison town's capacity. Food rations were meager, watery soup, moldy bread, occasional scraps. The weak collapsed in the courtyards. The sick filled the infirmaries until there was no more space. Ronald watched it all through the eyes of a child who should have been in school, not a ghetto. He remembered the long lines for food, the hollow faces of prisoners clutching tin bowls. He remembered the silence that fell whenever the SS officers patrolled by, boots striking the cobblestones like iron metronomes marking time toward death. And he remembered the constant fear that they would be next on a transport eastward. The adults knew what the East meant. The children learned by watching their parents' eyes. One morning in November 1944, an announcement crackled through the camp, and Ronald sensed something terrible in the air. The prisoners were ordered into labor groups, each assigned a section of the columbarium, a vaulted building where thousands of urns containing the ashes of the dead were stored. Urns with names. Urns with families behind them. Urns representing the vanished. The SS had decided the evidence had to be erased. Ronald stood in the cold with hundreds of others, forming a line nearly a kilometer long along the Oja River. One by one, urns were passed hand to hand toward the riverbank. Some were heavy, some rattled softly, some were warm from the sun. The urns had names and numbers on them, Ronald remembered. We passed them among ourselves. One boy said his grandmother was in the urn he held. A guard shouted, a man stumbled, the chain kept moving. Ronald could barely understand the enormity of what he was participating in. At 10 years old, he held death in his small hands and watched it fall into the river, where the current swallowed it without hesitation. It was a moment he would never forget, a moment that followed him through the rest of his life. As winter approached, the ghetto grew colder, more desperate. Starvation deepened, disease spread like wildfire. And then the worst of it hit: typhus. The epidemic raced through the barracks, infecting hundreds in days. Ronald's two brothers, Jakes and Abraham, fell ill one after the other. Their fevers were dangerously high, their skin burned to the touch. The infirmary was overcrowded, but Marie forced her way in, refusing to leave her sons. Hein paced outside the door night after night, waiting for news. Miraculously, both brothers survived. Many others didn't. Ronald saw bodies carried from the infirmary each morning, covered with sheets, silent, stiff. He saw the fear in the eyes of mothers who held onto their children as if they could anchor them to life by will alone. He also saw something else: evacuation transports. In early 1945, with the war turning decisively against Germany, prison trains from the east began arriving in Terezín. From the small window of the Hamburg barracks, Ronald watched them, the prisoners in striped uniforms, skeletal, barely alive, staggering out of boxcars. "The sight of the emaciated and dying prisoners stays with me to this day," he said. Some collapsed immediately, some begged for water. Others stared blankly, as if already gone. The ghetto groaned under the weight of new suffering. And yet the Watermans remained alive, together through a combination of luck, resilience, and timing. But liberation was still far away, and not all dangers had passed. February 1945, Terezín, Theresienstadt, Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. The wind swept across the ghetto with a razor's edge, slicing through thin coats and turning breath into smoke. Ronald pressed close to the small window of the Hamburg barracks, watching the newest evacuation transports arriving from the collapsing camps in the east. The sky was a dull, lifeless gray, almost the same color as the uniforms worn by the skeletal prisoners stumbling out of the boxcars. Men with hollow cheeks, women barely able to stand, children who looked older than time. Some collapsed the moment their feet touched the ground. Others were rolled out on makeshift stretchers by prisoners assigned to the labor detail. The smell carried on the wind: rot, sickness, starvation. Ronald had seen suffering before, but nothing like this. These people were not just ill, they were destroyed. The sight of the emaciated and dying prisoners in striped uniforms stays with me to this day, he would later say. And even now, 10-year-old Ronald felt his stomach twist with fear he couldn't fully understand. What kind of world could do this? And could it happen to him next? Behind him, the barracks buzzed with whispers: Auschwitz, Gross-Rosen, Stutthof, death marches, thousands freezing on the roads. The adults spoke quietly, but fear sharpened every word. Even those who had endured Terezín for months or years could feel it. The ghetto was coming apart. Disease, starvation, and the surge of dying evacuees pushed the fragile system past the breaking point. That winter, the typhus epidemic worsened. One by one, the sick collapsed in the courtyards and along the barracks walls. Doctors, prisoners themselves, worked to exhaustion with almost no medicine left. Ronald's brothers, Jakes and Abraham, were still recovering, their bodies weak, their fevered memories lingering in the dim light of the infirmary. Marie hovered over all four of her children like a guardian spirit, exhausted but unyielding. Hein tried to maintain some order of normalcy, tidying their sleeping area, saving scraps of bread for the youngest, speaking softly to keep fear at bay. But even he, Professor Hein Israel Waterman, a man who had survived by intellect and careful planning, began to look hollow. Each night, Ronald lay listening to the groans of the sick, the distant shouting of guards, and the eerie silence that followed when someone didn't wake in the morning. The ghetto felt like it was sinking. In March 1945, something changed. Word spread quietly but lightning fast. Germany was losing. The Red Army was closing in from the east. The Americans and British were crushing German divisions in the west. Rumors twisted through the barracks. The war is nearly over. The SS is evacuating camps. The Nazis are destroying evidence. Nobody knows what will happen to us. Some believed liberation was coming. Others feared extermination. The adults watched the guards closely. Tension coiled tighter every day, like a rope pulled to its breaking point. One night, Ronald woke to distant explosions rumbling like thunder. The ground trembled under his thin mattress. His mother sat beside him, stroking his hair. "It's all right," she whispered, though her voice shook. "The front is coming closer." To a child, the idea of armies moving like storms across Europe felt impossible to grasp. But he understood one thing. Something big was coming. By April, Terezín had become a chaotic crossroads of collapsing Nazi logistics. Transports arrived full of dying prisoners. Trucks rumbled through the gates at odd hours. Guards argued with each other in harsh German, discipline unraveling. Then, suddenly, the SS started to disappear. Some fled at night, others left disguised as Wehrmacht soldiers. A few remained, but their arrogance had turned brittle, fragile, almost desperate. In late April, white flags began appearing on buildings around the region, villages surrendering to advancing armies. Inside the ghetto, the prisoners held their breath. On May 2, 1945, the International Red Cross arrived at Terezín. Hours before their arrival, many remaining SS fled. The gates didn't open yet, but the air shifted. For the first time in years, the guards looked uncertain. Prison doctors and Red Cross representatives took over certain sections of the camp to fight the typhus outbreak. Ronald watched men wearing white armbands move through the courtyard like angels in a war-torn dream. Their supplies limited, but their presence bringing a strange, unfamiliar feeling. Hope. Real hope. Hein clutched Ronald's shoulder. "Remember this moment," he said quietly. "History is turning." May 5, 1945. Soviet tanks rolled into the outskirts of Terezín shortly before noon. Their engines growled like beasts announcing the end of an era. Prisoners rushed to windows, courtyards, rooftops. A few cried out. Others simply stood stunned, unable to process the sight. Ronald watched from the barracks steps as Red Army soldiers entered the ghetto, greeted by cheers that rose like a wave of sound. Some prisoners collapsed in gratitude. Others embraced strangers. For the first time since 1940, the Waterman family felt the crushing weight of fear lift, even if only slightly. They were alive, all of them, against all odds. But liberation didn't mean safety. Typhus still raged. Food was scarce. And the trauma of years under Nazi rule would linger for a lifetime. Yet that day, May 5th, remained a turning point, the first breath of a world returning. Ronald would remember it forever. The sound of tank treads, the waving of makeshift flags, the moment when a child who had seen too much suffering finally saw victory. But freedom was still a journey, and the world they would return to was not the same one they had left. May 13th, 1945. Dresden, on the road from Terezín to the Netherlands. The sky above the columns of refugees stretched pale and endless, a colorless sheet over a Europe that had barely survived its own destruction. The Waterman family moved slowly along the congested road, part of a strange river of liberated prisoners, displaced civilians, and exhausted soldiers. The smell of smoke still clung to the air, war's final breath. Soviet trucks rumbled past occasionally, dropping rations where they could. Some prisoners cried with relief as they grabbed the bread. Others simply ate in silence, too hollowed out to show emotion. Ronald clutched his mother's hand, staying close as they walked. He didn't know where home was anymore, not really. He only knew one thing. They were going back. Back to Delft. Back to a place that lived only in memory now. Hein walked ahead, speaking with a Red Cross volunteer about transportation north. His tall figure, once commanding in the lecture halls at Delft University, was thinner now, shoulders stooped. But his resolve remained intact. Marie moved beside him, guiding all 4 children with unbreakable focus, her strength a quiet, steady force. As night fell, they reached a temporary camp run by the Allies. Ronald watched soldiers distribute blankets to survivors who had spent years sleeping on wooden planks or flea-infested straw. A doctor examined his brothers, still weak from typhus but improving, and offered the family a place near the heaters. It was the first warm night they'd had in months. And yet, when Ronald closed his eyes, he still heard the cattle cars. He still saw the urns. He still smelled the sick rooms of Terezín. Liberation, he realized, didn't erase memory. It only allowed you to carry it forward. The journey home took weeks. Train routes were broken, rail lines bombed, bridges destroyed. They moved by truck, by rail, sometimes by foot when necessary. Through villages flattened by artillery, through cities burned to skeletons, through fields pockmarked with craters. War had not just claimed lives, it had erased landscapes. On the border of the Netherlands, Dutch soldiers greeted them not with suspicion, but with tears. Many families had not survived. Many names would never be crossed off transport lists. But the Watermans, miraculously, were intact. All of us, Ronald would later say, still marveling, every single one of us came back. June 1945, Delft, the Netherlands. The Waterman family stood before their old home, an elegant brick building with ivy-covered walls, once filled with books, music, laughter. Now strangers lived there. A man opened the door, a woman behind him holding a child. They stared at the family of 6 standing silently on the doorstep, the yellow stars gone but the scars still visible in their faces. "This is our home," Hein said simply. The man hesitated, then lowered his eyes. "I'm sorry, we were placed here during the occupation." Hein understood. The family had nowhere to go and nothing to come back to. Their furniture was gone, their silver was gone, their belongings, taken by collaborators or looted during raids, scattered who knows where. They could not stay here, not yet. A host family stepped forward to take them in, kind Dutch citizens who opened their doors without hesitation. Ronald remembered the warmth of their kitchen, the unfamiliar smell of clean sheets, the quiet comfort of sleeping without fear of boots stamping down the hallway. For weeks, the Watermans lived there, slowly piecing themselves back together. Hein filed claims to reclaim the house. Marie helped the children bathe, eat, sleep. The brothers regained their strength, and Ronald, thin, wide-eyed, 10 years old, finally had a place to sit without rationing every breath. It felt strange to be back in Delft. The city was whole, but the community was not. Neighbors who once filled the streets were gone. Jewish shops shuttered forever. Friends who had not been on special lists, the Barneveld list, the Palestine list, had vanished into the transports that left from Westerbork and never returned. Ronald saw the sorrow in his parents' faces as they walked through familiar streets haunted by absence. Survival, he realized, was not just living. It was learning to stand among ghosts. 1947, Delft. 2 years passed. The world shifted again, slowly, unevenly. Europe rebuilt itself from rubble. Families built new traditions to replace those stolen from them. The Watermans reclaimed their home, though it felt different now, quieter. Ronald was 12 when he returned to the classroom for the first time. He sat at a desk, pencil in hand, surrounded by children who had never worn yellow stars, who had never watched trains leave for the east. He felt older than all of them. Driven, he threw himself into schoolwork with fierce purpose. He wanted, as he would later say, to be useful to the world. Education became his anchor, first in science, then in environmental engineering, eventually in public life. But he spoke little about the war. Not then. Not for decades. The memories were too heavy, too sharp, preserved like the insect specimens he had helped collect in the gardens of Barneveld, locked away in jars, labeled in handwriting, waiting for a time when he could finally open them again and face what he had survived. September 1950, Delft, the Netherlands. Morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the Waterman home, falling across shelves filled once again with books, mathematics, engineering, philosophy, the tools of a family trying to rebuild what had been stolen. 16-year-old Ronald sat at a polished wooden desk, his notebooks arranged neatly in front of him, the tip of his pen tapping lightly as he studied chemical reactions for his exam. Outside, bicycles rattled down the cobblestone street. The world sounded normal, almost peaceful. But inside Ronald's mind, two worlds lived side by side, the quiet city of Delft and the echoing barracks of Terezín. Some mornings he woke disoriented, expecting to hear boots outside the door or feel the icy air of the ghetto against his skin. Even now, 5 years after liberation, the memories clung to him, woven into the sound of every door closing, every fall of footsteps on the street. But he didn't speak of it, not yet. Like many survivors, Ronald learned to carry the past silently, folding it neatly, hiding it away so he could move forward. And he did move forward. In school, he excelled. His teachers praised him for his discipline, his curiosity, his calm, methodical mind. While other boys spent afternoons wandering the town, Ronald stayed late at his desk, solving problems with quiet intensity. Science gave him structure, engineering gave him direction. Knowledge gave him back some sense of control. He studied because he had survived. He studied because he could. 1955, Delft University of Technology. The lecture hall buzzed with the chatter of young engineers as Ronald took a seat near the front. He was now a university student, lean, focused, quietly determined. Professors knew him as a promising thinker, a young man who approached every topic with precision and depth. He rarely spoke of the war, but it shaped him nonetheless. His interest in environmental engineering came from a nearly instinctive understanding of how fragile human systems were. He had lived through the collapse of every structure meant to protect people, the law, the government, the police, even society itself. If humans could destroy their world, he believed, humans could save it too, through science, rational planning, and responsible stewardship. His professors recognized something rare in him: determination without arrogance, intelligence without cruelty, a seriousness born not from ambition, but from responsibility. By the time he completed his studies, Ronald had already begun writing academic papers, succinct, technical, grounded in data and foresight. It was the beginning of a career that would span decades. 1960s, Delft. The Netherlands entered a period of modernization, transforming its waterways, industries, and cities. Ronald became deeply involved in environmental projects, coastal protection, delta management, ecological engineering. He traveled extensively, consulted internationally, and developed innovative ideas that would later define his field. Colleagues admired him for his clarity of thought. Students respected him for his fairness. Government officials relied on him for his expertise. But the past remained quietly present in his life. He kept documents from Terezín stored carefully in a wooden cabinet: ration cards, camp notes, official papers stamped with the insignia of the Reich. He kept the Terezín banknotes, printed as part of the Nazis' grotesque propaganda system. Most of all, He kept the memories, unspoken, unshared, living in silence. His family had survived together, a rarity among Dutch Jews. But survival came with a price. Ronald's parents aged quickly after the war, the strain of fear and hunger etched permanently into their faces. His siblings carried their own scars, each shaped by what they had seen. The world saw progress, but inside the Waterman home, the past had never truly left. 1990s, Delft. Age deepened Ronald's sense of responsibility. By now he was a respected figure in environmental engineering, known across Europe for his contributions. He wrote, published, lectured, and advised. His work shaped policy, protected coastlines, and influenced generations of engineers. Yet as he reached his late 60s, something shifted. The silence began to feel heavy, too heavy. His children, adults now, asked about the war. His students asked about his childhood. And museums, historians, and Jewish organizations began collecting testimonies, understanding that time was running out. One evening, sitting in his study with yellowed documents spread across the table, Ronald realized something. His story wasn't just his. It belonged to history. And history needed truth. He began to speak, carefully, quietly at first. Interviews, educational talks, small community events. His voice shook at times, but he spoke anyway. He talked about Barneveld, about Westerbork, about Terezín, about the urns carried to the river, about the children who didn't come home. He did it because he could still remember their faces, and because the world needed to hear what he had seen. Present day, Delft. At 90 years old, Ronald still works, still publishes, still speaks multiple languages. His mind remains sharp, his voice calm. He walks through the same city streets he once feared he would never see again, and he continues to share his story, not for himself, but for the millions who never returned. He is one of the last living Dutch Jews who passed through Terezín, one of the last voices from a fading generation. A survivor who rebuilt his life not in the shadow of his past, but in defiance of it. Tomorrow he will sit down to write again, another paper, another idea, another contribution to the world. Because survival, for Ronald Waterman, has always meant more than just living. It has meant building. October 2023, Delft, the Netherlands. The morning light settled softly on the narrow Dutch canals as Ronald Waterman stepped through the old wooden gate behind his home. He moved slowly now. 90 years had carved gentleness into his limbs, but his posture remained upright, steady, the posture of a man who had always refused to bend to the weight of history. The air smelled of wet leaves and autumn soil. A distant bicycle bell rang across the street, and the world around him felt calm, almost ordinary. But Ronald understood something most people walking past his house never would. Ordinary life is a miracle. Ordinary mornings are a privilege. And every day he woke up breathing, he remembered the millions who never saw an ordinary morning again. He opened the door to his study, a quiet room lined with shelves overflowing with journals, textbooks, engineering reports, and decades of research. His desk was covered in neatly stacked papers, maps of coastal defenses, diagrams of environmental projects, drafts of new papers he still planned to publish. At 90, he wasn't slowing down. He refused to. He sat, adjusted his glasses, and glanced toward a small wooden box on the corner of his desk. It had traveled with him from the war, through university, through his career. Inside were the documents he had kept since Terezín, yellowed papers, brittle edges, fragile as moth wings. Terezín banknotes lay among them, propaganda currency printed to deceive the outside world. Ration cards, stamped orders, notes scribbled in pencil by prisoners long gone. The past, preserved in pieces of paper. Ronald lifted the box lid gently. He never opened it quickly. Memory deserved care. Later that afternoon, a Holocaust researcher visited him, a young woman from Prague who had traveled to Delft specifically to interview him. "You are," she said quietly as she set up her recorder, "one of the last people alive who can describe Terezín firsthand." Ronald nodded, folding his hands. He had heard this many times over the last decade, but each time it became truer. He began speaking in his steady, warm, Dutch-accented voice, switching between languages effortlessly: English, Dutch, German, occasionally Czech. Decades of scholarship had sharpened his mind into a precise instrument, but when he spoke of the war, there was a softness in him, a weight. He described the castle at Barneveld, the scientists, the children playing in the courtyard, the yellow stars on chests so small they barely held the fabric. He described Westerbork, the weekly transports, the hollow faces pressed against the slats of cattle cars. He described the 2-day journey in the suffocating dark, 75 people in a single car with one bucket. And he described Terezín, the shouting, the beatings, the barracks, the moment he carried an urn containing someone's grandmother to the river. The researcher wiped her eyes. Ronald didn't. He had learned long ago that tears were not necessary to honor the dead. The telling was enough. The truth was enough. After the interview, Ronald walked her to the door, shaking her hand warmly. "Continue your work," he told her. "Memory fades, but history must not." As she left, Ronald returned to his study. He sat at his desk again, slowly, thoughtfully, his fingers resting on the notebook he used every day. On its cover was a simple inscription: "For those who didn't survive, for those who can no longer speak." He opened it and wrote a few lines, notes for another article, another lecture. His handwriting, though more delicate now, remained steady. Outside, the wind rustled the old trees along the canal. The sound reminded him of something he hadn't thought about in years: the rustling of leaves outside Terezín's walls, when the world seemed impossibly far away. He breathed deeply, grounding himself in the present. He had survived, and his survival had responsibilities. As evening fell, Ronald moved to the small living room where a radio played soft classical music. He lowered himself into a chair, the same chair where he had read hundreds of books over the decades, where he had taught himself new languages, where he had planned projects that would protect coasts and rivers across Europe. On the shelf beside him sat a photograph of his family: his father, mother, brothers, and sister, taken long after the war, all smiling, all alive, a miracle in itself. He stared at the photo for a long moment. He didn't often pray. The Watermans had never been particularly religious, but gratitude was a form of prayer, and Ronald offered it silently every night. For Barneveld, for Westerbork, for Terezín, for liberation, for the chance to rebuild a life, and for the simple fact that he still lived, still worked, still contributed, still spoke, still remembered. The world had changed, history had moved on, but memory, his memory, remained sharp as ever. Because Ronald Waterman understood something with absolute clarity. When the last witnesses are gone, only the stories remain. And he would keep telling his for as long as breath stayed in his lungs.